My lifelong best friend used my identity to take out loans without my knowledge. When my credit appeared destroyed, he swore he knew nothing. He didn't know I'd already traced every transaction back to his address and had everything documented. There are betrayals you cannot anticipate because they come from where you least expect them. Not from the enemy. Not from a person with whom you have a history of conflict. Not from someone who at some point gave you reasons to doubt, but from the person you grew up with whom you shared birthdays and summers and the moments that build childhood, with whom you have photographs from when you were 6 years old and both of you had messy hair and scraped knees from running around. From that person, the betrayal that comes from there carries a different weight than any other. Not because it hurts more in the moment, but because it unravels backward. Because when you receive it forces you to go back through every year of the friendship asking what was real and what was not. And that question, once it exists, has no answer that leaves everything at peace. My name is Daniela. I am 33 years old. I am a certified public accountant, and for 27 years, I had a best friend named Andres, who had been part of my life since we were 6 years old, and whom, until 10 months ago, I would have described as the non-family person I trusted most in the world. 27 years. My entire conscious life. We were childhood neighbors, elementary school classmates, friends in the same group in middle school, confidants in university, even though we studied different careers in different cities and maintained a friendship with the dedication of two people who have decided that what they have is worth the effort to maintain. Andres was the best man I planned to ask when that moment came. He was the person I called when something went very well or very badly. He was, in every sense that matters, family. What he did with that trust one discovered by accident on a Monday in March when I called a bank to ask about a credit card I had never applied for that appeared on my credit history with a balance 4 years past due. The call to the bank was the beginning of an investigation that lasted 6 weeks, and that at the end left me with a 17-page file and a certainty I did not want to have. But I will go in order. The first sign had arrived weeks before that call, though at the time I did not recognize it as a sign. I had received a letter from a collections company addressed to my name with a debt I did not recognize. I had ignored it, assuming it was an administrative error of the kind that happens and gets resolved with a phone call. The call to resolve the error opened a conversation I did not expect. The collections representative read me the credit data. Opening date, registered address, contact phone number. The address was not mine. Neither was the phone number. I asked her what address they had on file. She read it to me. It was Andres' address. I was silent for several seconds. The representative asked if I was still there. I told her yes, that I needed to review my records and would call back. I hung up, and I sat looking at the number I had written on the paper in front of me. Andres' address. My brain immediately began constructing alternative explanations because that is what the brain does when it receives information it does not want to process in the direct way. It looks for lateral exits that allow reality not to be what it appears. Perhaps someone else had used his address. Perhaps there was an error in the records. Perhaps there was some administrative reason I was not seeing. But somewhere deeper than the alternative explanations, there was something that already knew the truth before I finished admitting it. I called my main bank that same day. I requested a complete report of my credit history. What they sent me the following day was the document that changed everything. 5 credits in my name that I had never applied for. 5. A credit card with a balance 4 years past due. 2 personal loans with payments in arrears. A credit line at a department store. An account at a second-tier finance company I had not even heard of. Opening dates that spanned a period of 6 years. 6 years. The damage to my credit history was the kind that is not repaired in months. It was the type of sustained destruction that requires years of active work to rebuild, and that in the meantime silently and permanently closes doors. I hired a fraud and identity theft expert. I did not search for one randomly online. I reached him through a recommendation from a colleague who had gone through something similar years earlier. He was a 50-year-old man, former official at a state attorney general's office, who now worked independently doing exactly the type of investigation I needed. I told him the situation with all the details I had. He told me that what I was describing had a recognizable pattern, and that with the information I already had, the credit opening dates, the registered contact details, and the address that had appeared in the first credit, He could trace the origin with a high probability of success. I told him to proceed. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest of my recent life. Not because the investigation was slow. The expert was meticulous and kept me informed with the regularity of someone who understands that the person on the other side needs to know what is happening. They were long because during those 6 weeks, I continued talking to Andres normally. I called him twice in that period. We talked about everyday things. He told me about a work project he was developing. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. And while I was telling him I was fine, I had in my mind the dates of the fraudulent credits and the address that had appeared in the first one and the question that still did not have a definitive answer, but that every day was answering itself more clearly. The expert presented the report to me on a Wednesday afternoon. 17 pages. The reconstruction was complete. The 5 credits had been opened using my personal information: full name, tax ID, date of birth, fiscal registration code. Information that is not difficult to obtain for someone who has known you your whole life, and who at different points in those 27 years had had legitimate access to documents of mine for reasons that at the time had been completely innocent. The applications have been made in person in 3 cases and digitally in 2. In the in-person cases, someone had presented themselves with falsified documentation using my data. The contact addresses registered in 4 of the 5 credits corresponded to Andres or to people linked to him. The contact phone numbers in 3 of the credits had been traced to prepaid lines that the expert had linked to purchases documented at establishments near Andres's home. And there was something else. In one of the digital credits, there was an access log from an IP address that the expert had traced to the internet network at Andres's home. An IP address. His network. His home. There was no alternative interpretation that could bear the weight of that evidence. I called him that same Wednesday night. I told him I needed to see him the following day, that it was important. He asked if I was okay. I told him the same thing I had told my dad weeks earlier in a different story, but with the same energy, that it depended on the conversation we were going to have. He arrived at my apartment at 7 in the evening on Thursday. He brought a bag of food, as he always did when we got together at my place, because it was the kind of gesture he had repeated hundreds of times in 27 years of friendship, and that in that moment, with what I knew, carried a weight I could not hold without it showing. I let him in. I let him put the food in the kitchen, and I told him that before eating, we needed to talk. I placed the expert's report on the table. I said nothing. I left it there and looked at him. Andres looked at it. I watched his face, and in his face I saw something I'd hoped not to see, and that nevertheless did not completely surprise me when it appeared: recognition. That specific moment when a person sees that what is in front of them is too solid for any denial strategy to work, and where they have to decide in real time what to do with that. He said my name. I told him to let me speak first. I told him what I knew: the 5 credits, the dates, the addresses, the phone numbers, the IP address. I told him the report was from an expert with experience in state attorney general offices, and that the documentation it contained was the type that public prosecutors recognize as valid evidence. I told him that before deciding what to do with that information, I needed to hear him. Not because I needed him to convince me of anything, but because 27 years deserved at least that I give him the space to say what he had to say. What Andres said in the following hour was one of the most painful conversations I have had. He did not deny it, not with 17 pages of forensic expert documentation in front of him. What he did was explain, and the explanation was worse than denial would have been. He told me he had gone through a financial crisis 7 years ago, that he had accumulated debts he could not pay, that he had made a decision he knew was wrong, but that at the time, in the desperate logic of someone who sees no way out, had seemed like it would be temporary, that he was going to resolve his situation and pay everything back before I noticed, that he had never been able to get out of the hole because every credit he opened to cover one problem created another, that he had lived with that for 7 years. I asked him whether at any point in those 7 years he had thought about telling me. He said every day. I asked him why he had not. He said he was afraid of losing me. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Andres was crying. I registered that peripherally with the distance of someone who is processing too much to be able to respond to the other person's crying with the empathy she would have had in any other circumstance. I thought about 27 years. I thought about the times I had been in crisis and called him, about the times he had been in crisis, or what I had believed were his crises, and I had been there, about the amount of trust one had deposited in that friendship, and that I had built on something that in a layer I had never seen had this story in it. I thought about my destroyed credit history, about the years it was going to take me to repair it, about the doors that had already closed silently without my knowing why. I said 3 things to him. I told him that what he had done had a legal name, and that name was identity fraud and improper use of personal data. That the evidence I had was sufficient to file a formal complaint with a high probability of success. I told him he was going to need to sign a debt acknowledgement for the total amount of the fraudulent credits, plus interest and damages to my credit history, with a verifiable payment plan, and with the understanding that if the payment plan was interrupted, I would file the complaint without further conversation. And I told him our friendship was over, not in anger, with the cold sadness of someone who has made a decision she knows is correct, and who also knows that the correct thing does not always feel good. Andres signed the document my attorney prepared 2 days later, not without trying to negotiate the terms, not without an additional conversation where he looked for angles I had not considered. But in the end, he signed because the alternative was the formal complaint, and the weight of the evidence did not leave much room for optimism on his side. The payment plan has been active for 7 months. He has complied. I do not know if he will continue complying. I have the complaint prepared and ready to file if there is a single payment that does not arrive on the agreed date. My credit history is in the process of repair. It is slow. It is the type of process that requires active patience, which is the hardest kind of patience. But it is moving forward. I have not spoken to Andres since the day he signed the document. I did not block him. I did not declare any war. There is simply nothing to say that we have not already said, and the silence is the natural consequence of that. There are mutual friends who occasionally ask. I tell them we drifted apart. It is true, even if it is not complete. What cost me most is not Andres' absence specifically. It is the space he left. The space of someone with whom you had built 27 years of history, and who suddenly is not there. That space has its own shape, and takes time to fill with something new. It is not completely filled yet. Perhaps it will not fill exactly. Perhaps what grows in that space will be different from what was there before rather than a replacement. I do not know yet. What I want you to take from his story has 2 levels. The first is completely practical. Check your credit history once a year, even if you have not applied for any credit. In Mexico, you can do it for free through the Buró de Crédito or Círculo de Crédito once every 12 months. In other countries, there are equivalents with periodic free access. Do not wait to receive a collections letter to find out what your history says. By the time the collections letter arrives, the damage has been done for a while. The second is harder to articulate, but more important. Trust is not a fixed quantity. It is something that is built and that can be destroyed, and that destroyed leaves a space that does not always fill in the same way. But destroyed trust can also become clarity. Clarity about who is who in your life, about what is real and what was the image you had of what was real, about the limits you can set that before you did not set because you had not had reason to set them. That clarity hurts, but it is yours, and nobody can take it from you. If this story shook you, comment. Do you check your credit history regularly? Like if you believe blind trust can be a vulnerability even when it comes from years of friendship. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who has never checked their credit history and needs to know they should. Practical tip. You can check your credit history for free once a year at the Buró de Crédito in Mexico, at Equifax, Experian, or TransUnion in the United States, or at the equivalent in your country. Also set up credit alerts if the service allows it, to receive notification when any new account is opened in your name.